Hello, and welcome to the Audrain Automobile Museum in Newport, Rhode Island. I'm Donald Osborne, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our new show, Balance and Power, The World on Two Wheels, 1885 to 1995. This is a very exciting show because it's our first all two-wheeled show focused on motorcycles. We've featured motorcycles before in some of our other exhibitions because they've always been a part of the Audrain collections. But this time we're taking an in-depth look at what has established the motorcycle as such an amazing and captivating object in our lives, and where it came from. The exhibition, presented by Reliable Carriers Incorporated, is divided into 7 sections. The first, the beginning, from velocipede to motorcycle through the bicycle. The second, between the wars. The third, post-war power, 50s and 60s. Then we go off into a little more detail, and small displacement and scooters, dirt bikes and scramblers, the great 70s superbike shootout, and finally, the Europeans versus the Big Four. There's a lot to cover. We've got more than 60 bicycles and motorcycles in this exhibition, and we won't be covering them all tonight. But please watch our YouTube channel for more in-depth, detailed videos on some of the very special bicycles and motorcycles in this exhibition. And to start the journey with our earliest motorcycles, I'm joined by David DiMuzio, our Executive Director here at the Audrain. Good evening, David.
Hi, Donald. So Donald, we have here 2 vehicles from Pierce. We know this name from Pierce Arrow cars, but much earlier, George Pierce manufactured bird cages, refrigerators, all sorts of things, industrial things. And along with that came the bicycle. Pierce was really part of the safety bicycle coming into popularity.
And David, just for a moment,
Yeah.
let's just take a word and just sort of introduce the safety bicycle.
Yeah.
We saw in the glimpse of the opening the high-wheeled bicycle that a lot of people know from early photos and engravings. And why was this called the safety bicycle?
Well, taking a header comes from the high wheeler. High center of gravity, very easy to pitch yourself over the handlebars. So the idea of 2 equal-sized wheels lowered to the ground makes a lot of sense. But that only happens and works when you go to a belt or chain drive. You no longer have direct drive pedals on your front wheel. So it was always just called the safety in the period. So in the late 19th century, extremely popular. You know, the whole idea that you had the freedom to be under your own power. Well, of course, you could walk places, but no horses involved. So extremely popular in society. And this is a great example of a Pierce cushion-framed ladies' safety bicycle.
Another great advance that the bicycle afforded was freedom of movement for women.
That's right, and you can see the chain and the rear wheel are protected, so you won't get your dress caught in it while you're riding it. It's a step-through frame, easy to mount. It also is a seamless tube frame, and even though this is an unrestored bicycle and doesn't currently have tires on it, it did have the very earliest version of pneumatic tires made by Dunlop.
And you mentioned the fact that Pierce made bicycles and other industrial objects and also cars. The connection between early bicycle manufacturing and technology and the development of the car is really important, and we can see this in the kind of metal work and things like that that were required to make these bicycles.
Yeah, and I think some of these techniques used in bicycles really bring us into the automobile age. But really, this is one of my favorite motorcycles in the exhibition because it's very unusual in appearance as well as performance. It's the first 4-cylinder motorcycle engine made in America. You can see the frame is a bit odd looking. It's because the fuel and oil are contained within the frame. Another feature that you don't see, or you do see, but very early on, shaft drive, no chain. Well, there is a chain, but that's only to start. We'll talk about that later, but only to start the motorcycle.
Yeah, this motorcycle definitely deserves an in-depth video.
Yeah,
which
we will definitely spend some time with this later.
It's a fascinating and absolutely beautiful piece. One of the things that's also quite interesting about this exhibition is that I think it will show our visitor guests the fact that why people collect motorcycles. People that ride them, people that view them as artistic objects, I personally have never ridden a motorcycle. I know that you are motorcycle mad. So it's an amazing way that people can come together and appreciate objects for different reasons.
Absolutely.
Now let's take a look at another great early bicycle.
How about this, Donald? This is the most remarkable bicycle I think I've ever seen.
It is truly a piece of amazing sculpture. And when you get into some of the details of this, it's astonishing. Tell us about this, David.
Yeah, so Audrain Wheel Company manufactured this in Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts. This is about 1900. It is a safety bicycle, but that's not really what's so important about it. If you look at it, and they talk about this, and there are lots of patents discussing getting suspension and comfortable ride because of the rough roads of those days. This is nicknamed the half heart because the front fork is half of a heart. It's an articulated suspension, proprietary chain drive. The Victor model was their flagship. That's what this is. It's unrestored, so we've lost the leather seat at some point. You do see it up in the illustration. But what this really shows is the suspension built into the seat itself, for comfort. Victor was also the first manufacturer to use hollow, solid tires, again, for the idea of getting a little more comfort on the road.
The combination of the design for function and the functionality of the design is absolutely amazing in this bicycle. Yeah. The frame itself is just an absolute work of art, and all of the details, the workmanship, is absolutely extraordinary. And it's also interesting in bicycles of this age and in the early motorcycles to see that combination of the artisan and the industrial combine. And it's, again, something that really led to the ability of manufacturers to make artful objects in large numbers, which was happening for the first time at this period.
It's just wonderful.
And then we go to something which is really exciting and to me slightly frightening when we see our next pair here. Let's talk about these, David. Now, David, here we've got another fascinating bicycle, also with a local New England connection. Tell us about that.
Yes, Columbia Bicycles is the predecessor to Pope Manufacturing, who made the motorcycle sitting below it. What's interesting about this bike is it's shaft drive, no chain. So shaft drive, very common before chain manufacturing was standardized.
So now we're through the horror of World War I, and motorcycles are really coming into their own. And here we see motorcycles that people can really understand and relate to for the first time, I think. And very, very, very famous name, Indian. Let's talk about that, David.
Yes, this is a 1931 Indian Scout 101, the last year that the 101 was made. 45 cubic inch displacement, sitting next to a Harley, which we'll talk about at another time. But fierce competition between Harley and Indian. But Indian certainly was very well known as a race bike, board track racer. The Scout 101 was a notch below the Chief, but their most popular road bike.
And it's interesting too that the popularity of motorcycles really grew after World War I because, of course, World War I was the first mechanized combat, and motorcycles had an important role in World War I. And a lot of that was carried after the war to people that rode them in the war.
Yeah, so these were utilitarian bikes in the war. But, the war and the Depression really pushes, you could think of it as the big three. There are lots of manufacturers earlier on, but it really boils down to Indian, Excelsior, and Harley Davidson.
And we'll see a little later sort of what happened to that trio.
We'll have a great conversation about the fierce competition between those three brands.
And carrying this technology, again, to a wider market, we begin to see a bit of a combination of bicycles and motorcycles. Let's take a look at one of those.
Yes.
So David, we see something which is sort of a bit of a throwback here as we go into the future. Tell us about that.
Yeah, these are interesting, and this is a whole genre of we call motorized bicycles. So this is the Merkle motor wheel. There's also a connection with Indian because Hindi Manufacturing, who owns Indian, buys the rights to the Merkle motor wheel and produces it in Massachusetts. So it's literally a motor you buy as a kit and you bolt it on to your existing bicycle. So this is just a normal bike you would buy in the 20s and 30s. I should say next to it the Whizzer, another brand that Schwinn incorporated a motor onto, but this is much earlier. This is 1923.
And David, what kind of power would something like this put out?
Oh, it was capable of 20, 25 miles an hour, and it's under 2.5 horsepower.
20 to 25 miles per hour, and the brakes?
It doesn't really stop. They usually had a band brake only on the back, only on the rear wheel. It would slow you down, but not stop you quickly.
Riding one of these causes you to plan ahead.
That's true of most early motorcycles.
And it's very interesting. Again, the name of this exhibition, Balance and Power. Now, how difficult might it be to ride one of these in terms of balance? Because you've got a lot of weight on the rear wheel, and
yeah, it's not ideal, but it's a way for someone who maybe couldn't afford a motorcycle, could get something motorized going with a bicycle they already own.
It's a fascinating concept, and we'll see what happens with small displacement in a totally different way. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you.
Well, we're past another war, and now we're into the 1950s. And we're really going to see the application of power in motorcycles. And to help tell this story is Ben Chester, our curatorial and operations coordinator here at the Audrain. Ben, what have we got here?
Well, Donald, right here we've got 5 great British bikes from the late 40s and the early 50s. After World War II, everyone was looking to get mobile. Everyone needed a mode of transportation, but no one really had a large amount of funds to afford a luxury vehicle, whether it was a car or a motorcycle. And the factories, frankly, didn't have the materials available to produce things in mass quantities. So these British brands you see here really focused on high-performance modes of transportation. Companies like Vespa, companies like Lambretta at the time, were producing small displacement scooters that we'll touch on in a minute, that were effective as point-to-point transportation. They were small, maybe 100, 125 cc vehicles that would get you to work or deliver parcels around the city. These bikes you see here are far from those methods of transportation. I'm going to be talking about the BSA Gold Star and the Vincent here, both some of the fastest motorcycles at the time, and both from Britain. This BSA Gold Star is actually loaned from one of our volunteers, Richard Hunter, and is really, I don't know what you think, Donald, but it's really one of the most famous names in British motorcycling. What do you think?
Well, one of the points that we talked about before, Ben, is the fact that these are British bikes. Britain owned the high-end motorcycle market after World War II. And again, just as in World War I, the role that the motorcycle played in World War II also helped the development of the motorcycle through. The pre-war motorcycles from BMW were very advanced, and they taught the Brits a few things about that, and the Brits took it through, and by the time that the war ended, they had the best motorcycles on the planet.
Yep.
And the Gold Star, this is an interesting story. Tell us about that.
Yeah,
Why is it the Gold Star?
It is an interesting story. So if you lapped the Brooklands in England at over 100 miles an hour, you were awarded a lapel pin that was a Gold Star. It basically certified you and your bike at 100 miles an hour. When Wal Handley did this on a BSA Empire Star and completed a lap at 100 miles an hour, he was awarded that lapel pin. BSA, being marketing geniuses of the time, said, well, why don't we capitalize on this and make our own Gold Star? That's frankly what they did. It's hard to believe this bike is 70 years old. It's from 1947, but there's so many advanced features on this, such as the twin shocks you see at the rear. When most motorcycles were using swing arms, this was incredibly advanced, but at the same time, it was a result of factories not having the quantity of materials to be able to produce the traditional methods of suspension and other parts of the bike. But this is a 500cc model. This bike would probably do 110 miles an hour at the time. We have to ask Richard if he's done that recently on this bike, but this bike's been completely restored. It was originally sold in California, and we're super proud to have it here.
another very interesting point that you bring up. You talked about the scarcity of materials and what was happening in Britain in the post-war period. It was also a period of export or die. So a lot of these motorcycles were sold in the United States because it was very important for British manufacturers to sell abroad and earn hard currency. That also helped to spread the motorcycle feeling and craze across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Now tell us about our other motorcycle here, a very famous name indeed.
You want to talk about high-performance motorcycles, Donald, and going as fast as you can here in the United States. We've got a great story here with this Vincent, but in the late 40s, Vincent set out to make the fastest motorcycle they possibly could, and they really engineered the Black Shadow to fill that void for them and really, take the crown as the fastest motorcycle in the world. But Rolly Free, we're going to tell the story about him in this show. He set a world record on this, not this bike, but a Vincent motorcycle. He did 150 miles an hour at the Bonneville Salt Flats. He had all this protective material ready to go. He strapped on the bike and did 147 miles an hour. He said to the engineers,
Not fast enough.
I think I can go faster. And he took all the protective material off, stripped down to his boxers, and laid on the Vincent motorcycle and achieved 3 miles an hour faster on another run. Ended up doing 150, which is astonishing and perhaps crazy, but another advanced bike of the time, this Vincent Black Shadow, with twin drum brakes at both the front and the rear. One of the first bikes that could really stop as well as it could go, which was a phenomenon at the time. Hard to even believe, but this is another bike. I believe this is the first one with twin shocks at the rear, giving the bike better handling and better balance all around. Another crazy thing about this bike is the engine is not really attached to the frame. The engine is a stressed member of the bike, and if you wanted to remove the engine from the bike, it's really impossible. You have to take the bike apart around the engine in order to access the engine, which is an incredible engineering advancement.
The technological advances that you mentioned on this Vincent are also quite interesting because there's often a cross between technology in cars and technologies in motorcycles. And you mentioned the fact that this Vincent could actually stop as well as it could go. The go-stop ratio is something that is fascinating to look at in all motor vehicles. And as you point out, they learned to stop a fast bike many, many, many years before they learned to stop a fast car. And some of these ideas, again, many of these came through racing, and many motorcyclists who are very successful in championship motorcycle racing came to cars and brought some of those ideas with them to the car manufacturers. So it's interesting to see these motorcycles not only as great technological objects in themselves, but as pace setters.
Absolutely. And we'll talk more about pace setting and engineering advancements more in the scrambler and dirt bike section, but more on that to come.
But before we get there, we're going to go from 100 miles per hour and high technology to scooters. Let's take a look at that.
Sounds good.
So Ben, from 100 miles per hour and twin brakes on the front and rear wheels, we're here at something very different. What do we got?
Yeah, this is a bit different, Donald. Instead of 100 miles an hour, we've got 125 cc's here in this Vespa. This really great example of a Vespa was loaned to us from our friend Victor Pedro over in Narragansett. But after the war, everyone was looking to get mobile, especially in European cities, and companies like Piaggio went to great lengths to produce simple, cheap, and effective transportation that was reliable for the masses. And the Vespa was really a product of the times. It was attractive, it was stylish, it was quiet, easy to maintain, easy to ride. You could keep talking about the great advantages of these. But really, one of the most attractive parts of this, you could call it a motorcycle, you could call it a scooter, but the engine was totally covered. So there was no grease, there's no oil, there's no dirty parts of the machine being shown, which was really an innovation at the time.
And this allowed this to become a commuter vehicle. So you could go to work in this and not worry about showing up covered with grease and oil and smelling of fumes. Well, you might smell of fumes because there were so many scooters on the road that the person in front of you was spewing fumes on you. I remember quite vividly the first time I went to Italy in the late 1970s. Most of the traffic on the streets in the big cities were still scooters. Mm-hmm. Scooters and little Fiat Cinquecentos. And it's got seats for two, but it was not unusual to see 3 or 4 people on a scooter. Mm-hmm. So the practicality of this is really something, and when you think about coming from the bicycle age through to the scooter age, this is all of a sudden a level of mobility that many people just did not have before.
Absolutely, yeah. It allowed people to get essentially anywhere they wanted. Even in the image behind you, Donald, you could end up at a farm with lambs running around in a matter of no time. But these were absolutely an innovation and changed the landscape of transportation, for years to come. It was great to see these.
And speaking of changing landscapes, let's take a look at a mini bike that changed the landscape here in America. Now, in America, for the most part, motorcycles were still something that other people rode. All of a sudden, American families began to see motorcycles in their houses, and usually from the youngest member of the family. Let's talk about this.
Yeah, Donald, that's a great point. Not only were families seeing the motorcycles in their house, the entire family at one point had a motorcycle. And this Trail 70 was a great example of that. This could have been a beginner motorcycle for maybe someone 12 or 13 to learn how to ride. But at the same time, it was really a dual-purpose machine, as you could register them for the road then and still today, drive it around Newport to Cars and Coffee, perhaps. But this is actually a manual transmission model with a 4-speed. This was a traditional, transmission at the time for many motorcycles, but Honda did offer a semi-automatic transmission with no clutch that you could just shift with your foot. But these were great for the entire family, and with bikes like the Trail 70 and others on this shelving, it allowed the whole family to get out and explore and get on the trails together.
And it was one of those things that began to introduce the idea of a motorcycle as something not very threatening, something for amusement and for pleasure.
Yeah, at the time, motorcycles had a reputation for attracting outlaws and bandits and whatnot. Motorcycle gangs were starting to form, so friendly green Honda trails really were changing the image of that. And with kids and young people growing up on motorcycles like this, they often graduated to other Hondas and other motorcycles similar to this, but larger. So it really drew enthusiasts for life. I know our director, David DiMuzio, had something very similar to this, and I can tell you he's still into motorcycles today, as you can see here.
Indeed. Now, Ben, let's take this the next step to see how crazy some of this could be. Let's take a look at some scramblers and dirt bikes.
Sure.
So the spirit of that Honda 70 lives on in something rather bigger and much more powerful. Let's talk about this baby.
Yeah, the Husqvarna name, Donald, is very famous today. They produce some of the best chainsaws and farm equipment the world has ever seen. Coming from Sweden, they were a bit distant from the traditional picture of scramblers and dirt bikes. You saw many from Honda coming through, and other great brands like Boltaco with their trials bikes, but Husqvarna's marketing scheme with this motorcycle and their other products at the time was absolutely brilliant. The Bruce Brown movie on any Sunday featured Steve McQueen prominently with a Husqvarna very similar to this one you see right here. And you could see him thrashing through the desert on a bike like this, absolutely attracting the minds of young folks. But it was the same engineering that you saw in other bikes and vehicles, four-wheeled vehicles at the time, that really advanced not only this Husqvarna, but all the dirt bikes and scramblers in this section, as competition was at the root of what all these companies were trying to, they're trying to better their motorcycles, and competition allowed them to test their products and improve them on the track. And
this competition was not fooling around with fun bikes on dirt.
Nope.
This is as serious as the Baja 1000 for cars. This is really serious competition, and serious technology and engineering was demanded to make sure that you had a motorcycle that was capable of fulfilling the task.
Absolutely. These bikes were so well engineered with gobs of suspension travel. They allowed them to, tackle any divots or holes on dirt courses. At the same time, it was very fun. We're not going to lie about that. And I do know Steve McQueen may or may not have entered some competitions under a false name, but we'll maybe talk about that later. But yeah, the engineering advancements in these types of bikes were happening at a very fast rate for the time.
Well, let's take a look at something slightly more family friendly, but equally important in terms of putting people onto bikes.
Absolutely.
So we've gone from jumping over the hills in Baja to something rather more sedate, but maybe more important.
Donald, I would call it one of the most important bikes, not only in the show, but in the history of two-wheeled vehicles.
Wow.
This is a Honda Trail 55. It looks very simple because it is. Just like the Vespas across the room that we talked about, everyone in Asia was looking for a simple, effective means of transportation. At the time, Honda was selling Trail 50s at a rate of about 5,000 a month, but there was one dealer that was selling far more than any other dealer, so Honda went to check out why. Essentially, the dealer was fitting dual rear sprockets on some of those Trail 50s and pumping them out, marketing them as trail bikes, even though they looked just like the Trail 50 that they sold from the factory. So Honda changed their scheme. They started to sell all of their Trail 55s with the dual rear sprockets, which allowed higher and lower gears if you wanted to go off-roading. But these were used, put away wet. They were some of the most effective, motorcycles of all time, and they ended up selling tens of millions of them, and billions of people rode them. It's crazy to believe how influential this bike was, and it really is the vehicle that helped bring Honda to the point they're at today.
Well, Ben, you make a very good point about usability. The fact that it could be ridden around town and then taken off-road meant you didn't have to have two motorcycles for the same purpose. And it was also the bike that introduced that great slogan, "You meet the nicest people on a Honda." And again, it just shows the fact that motorcycles and the idea of riding a motorcycle was entering the mainstream more and more. Because who would ever say you meet the nicest people on well, I won't mention Harley because we're going to talk about them later, but it is something that shows the total integration of the motorcycle into life. And we're going to see a great example of how that really jumped in our next segment, the Great 70s Superbike Shootout. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thanks, Donald.
In 1970, Cycle magazine had a comparison test to find out which of the high-performance motorcycles on the market in the US was king of the hill. It transformed the way people looked at motorcycles in the US and established a new pecking order in motorcycle hierarchy. Take us through this section and our final section, Europeans versus the Big Four, is Antonio Meligari, our media production coordinator. Antonio, you are a bike nut. You grew up with them, you love to ride fast, so this is your world. Tell us about it.
Yeah, this is not a bad section we have over here. Obviously, I grew up with this stuff. I love these bikes, and we can really thank the CB750 behind you as really the first modern superbike that came to the world. It was comfortable, it was reliable, but it was also very fast. It had almost 70 horsepower, so at the time it was a pretty quick bike. It could run close to a 13.5-second quarter mile, so very fast at the time. So it was a big 750 motor, and it was unique because it was one of the first inline four-cylinders that Honda had done and brought into the United States. And we spoke about earlier the British motorcycles, how they really were running the world at that point. And it got to the point where the Japanese bikes started to take over, and you really saw that with this CB750 when it came out in 1969. And the other Japanese manufacturers really wanted to get involved with high horsepower and high speed. So we see a couple Kawasaki's here, and then also European with the BSA and Ducati, of course. So with the 750, we really see a bike that was reliable, and that was kind of pushing forward. They needed more reliable and comfortable motorcycles. And if we look over here to this Kawasaki 500, two-strokes were obviously coming up through the ranks, where we saw a lot of them in racing and on the street. So this Kawasaki 500 two-stroke was an easier way to get involved into the Superbike Shootout. It was a cheaper alternative, but consequently enough, it was a lot more difficult to ride. It had a really choppy throttle. The power came on at 5,000 RPM, and younger riders who could afford this bike, it really took them by surprise because they didn't experience that kind of power before, and it was pretty dangerous. This had drum brakes, so it didn't stop as well as some of the other competitors in the class with disc brakes. It wasn't that bad because the bike was lighter, but still it wasn't as safe as maybe the CB750 with disc brakes.
One of the things that's also quite interesting, of course, we saw in the early part of the exhibition the four-cylinder Pierce from the beginning of the 20th century. And now we're seeing, again, this multi-cylinder motorcycle phenomenon, and where we're going for pure power. You have engines on these motorcycles as large as those in cars. And you mentioned the fact that the smaller Kawasaki two-stroke engine didn't have the balance that some of these larger engines have. And that's one of the things that I find curious, because it seems to me that riding a motorcycle with this immense engine down below you, the balance must be really tricky, but actually you're saying it's actually the opposite way. It actually helps stabilize the bike.
Yeah, in this sense, certainly. With a larger four-cylinder, four-stroke engine, you have a really smooth power band, whereas with this three-cylinder, two-stroke, the power band is really all over the place. So something like the CB750 would be a lot easier to ride.
And so who did end up winning the shootout?
The Kawasaki actually won the shootout, but what took the hearts of the testers and my heart was the Ducati 750. And this was an important motorcycle because the 750 GT was the first L-twin Ducati that was made, and that was really their iconic motor that has progressed over time. And although it wasn't the fastest, it handled really well. It actually handled better than some of its competitors. And the tester said that they wanted to take the Ducati home. I do as well, but so which was interesting.
Well, we're going to now take our final step in the exhibition into the modern age, and I know that there are things here that are really close to your heart. Let's take a look.
Precisely.
We've got two Italian icons here. Well, three, counting you, Antonio, of course. So let's talk about these motorcycles.
So, two bikes obviously very close to my heart. The Bimota DB1 here and the Ducati 916. So interestingly enough, the Bimota company was founded in 1973, and they built really nice custom frames and fairings for various motorcycle manufacturers. And in '85, they built a prototype for Ducati, hence the name DB1, the first Bimota with a Ducati engine. And they built this prototype for Ducati, and Ducati was really impressed, but ultimately there was some disagreements that went through with Bimota and Ducati management.
Disagreements in Italy?
Yeah,
That's never happened.
I know. Maybe on the coffee break or whatever. So there were some disagreements, and ultimately the project was canceled, and Ducati owned the rights to the design. Obviously, Bimota was not very happy about this, and they approached Ducati and asked if they could purchase the rights to the design. Ducati accepted, and they went ahead and they built this DB1. Afterwards, when Ducati saw that the DB1 was a production bike, I wouldn't say they were mad or jealous, but it definitely made them a little angry. And Cagiva, who actually owned Ducati at the time, phoned Massimo Tamburini to design a bike, a Ducati, so the Ducati Pazzo. And Tamburini was actually one of the original founders of Bimota. He wasn't working for Bimota at the time, he was working for Cagiva. And it's one of the only times where you can see, in my opinion, that a Tamburini design is not as beautiful as its competitor. So Bimota kind of had the one-up on Ducati on that one. And it's,
Let's talk a little bit about the design, because this is one of the first fully fared-in motorcycles. And
Yes.
it's very interesting to see, because that's something obviously that we see in a lot of race bikes, but not street bikes. And I
Yep.
mean, the bike is absolutely beautiful.
So this is really where you start to see full-fared motorcycles that really resemble racing bikes on the street. As you can see, the fairing goes all the way underneath, and this bike just exudes aerodynamics. I mean, it's so sleek. They really did a good job, even with the paint job, to just make it look like it's cutting through the air. And this bike was pretty light, but it had about 65 horsepower. So not a crazy amount of power, but it had a good power to weight ratio. And these were actually very popular in Japan. A lot of them were sold to Japan. There's not too many of them in the United States, though.
And then we have this Ducati, which I know is very near and dear to your heart and clearly shows the influence of the design of the Bimota.
Yeah, so the 916 is my favorite motorcycle of all time, so I might be a little biased talking about this. But the man who penned the 916 was actually the same man who penned the DB1, Massimo Tamburini. And Cagiva, again at the time, owned Ducati. They phoned him and they said, we need to make a bike that really makes a statement. At the time, in the late 80s and the early 90s, Ducati was winning a lot of races and world championships and World Superbike with the 851 and the 888. But they needed a superbike for the road that was unlike no other. So he went ahead and he designed this, and it was really a motorcycle that no one had ever seen before. the design was so striking with the undertail exhaust and the sleek fairings and the cutaways on the gas tank. This was a real race bike for the street. And when it was announced, it actually sold out in the United States. People were so excited about buying this bike. And it was lightweight, had a lot of power, 114 horsepower, because they needed to combat against the Japanese manufacturers on and off the track. So this was really the bike that, not that put them on the map, but really cemented themselves as a serious motorcycle brand in the 90s.
And what's also fascinating for me about this particular motorcycle, as somebody who really appreciates them for their aesthetics and their engineering design, is that you look at this and it's got the combination of the design in the fairings of the Bimota, but it also shows a bit of its structure. So it goes back to those very early beautiful bicycles that we see in the exhibition.
Certainly.
Showing their strength and the interesting design and packaging engineering. The packaging in this is absolutely astonishing. It's like a Formula One car.
Yeah, it really is like a Formula One car on the road, but a bike. Like you said, with the packaging, everything is really just in there, super tight. You can see the trellis frame. And I look at these and I think of them as works of art, even with the single-sided swing arm. It wasn't the first bike to do a single-sided swing arm, but that was really a famous aspect of this bike. And I mean, when I see it, it reminds me of my childhood. I saw the first one when I was 4 or 5 years old, and that was a defining moment for me, because I knew that I truly loved these bikes when I saw it for the first time. And whenever I see it, I get the same feeling that I felt when I was a little kid.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in this exhibition. When you come to visit this exhibition, you will feel the connections, whether they be with a modern superbike, with an antique bicycle, or a trail bike that you might have ridden as a child. Thank you for joining us on this very brief highlight tour of our new exhibition, Balance and Power, The World on Two Wheels, 1885 to 1995. The exhibition will be open from February 20th through May 16th, here in our gallery on Bellevue Avenue. You can also, of course, visit us on the internet, watching our YouTube videos in which we will profile individual motorcycles in this exhibition and some of the bicycles to give you more detail about what makes these objects so fascinating. And if you want to take a little bit of our show home with you, here in our shop in the gallery, we have on sale merchandise illustrating our bicycles and motorcycles, as well as other merchandise with our logo on it. You can also buy this online at our website, audrainautomuseum.org. Thank you very much for watching, and we hope to see you here in the gallery or on our YouTube channel soon.